Today we will be talking about the Hebrew Bible, what it is, and its structure. In this video we will begin by discussing what Scripture is, and understanding how that term applies to the Hebrew Bible and helps us better understand it. We will also break down the differences between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. Later on in the video, we will get into discussing the structure of the Hebrew Bible and its three major parts. Towards the end of the video, we'll talk about different versions of the Bible, not necessarily English translations, but the different Hebrew, Greek, and Latin translations that have developed over history. Before we get into talking about the Hebrew Bible, we need to ask, what is Scripture? Scripture is a term we use in a variety of religious traditions to study the text that the traditions find important. To give a definition for this, Scripture is a written text that is considered by adherents to the religious tradition to have some connection to the sacred or other, and is considered authoritative for the tradition. A few key terms to focus on in this definition. First, Scripture is something that is written. A written text may begin as an oral tradition in the case of many of the texts of the Hebrew Bible. Over time, the stories were passed down to the descendants of the person who originally had the story. But to become Scripture, the text has to eventually be written down in a hard copy. One of the other terms is sacred. This term is somewhat ambiguous. Many people disagree on what this means. Sacred is something that is other. It's something beyond the self, beyond the everyday. So in some religious traditions, this might refer to God, gods, goddesses, perhaps in Buddhism, nirvana, some kind of understanding of something else in the world, beyond ourselves. Scripture is also something that is authoritative. Later on in the video, we'll talk about canonization, but canonization, or putting together some selection of texts, is what makes Scripture authoritative and makes the text Scripture. This means that the text holds some kind of importance for the tradition and tells adherents how to live their everyday lives, how to carry out rituals, and how to connect with the sacred or other. Before we talk about the Hebrew Bible itself, let's look at a few other examples of Scripture. Of course, the Hebrew Bible is an example of Scripture for the Jewish tradition. It is something that is authoritative, that is written down, and gives some kind of connection to something beyond the self, something sacred or other. The New Testament is an example of Scripture for a Christian audience. The Quran is an example of Scripture for a Muslim audience. The Tao Te Ching is an example of Scripture for Taoism. It explains the virtuous way and how to connect with creation and understand wisdom. The Sutras are an example of Scripture for Buddhism. These record the Buddha's sermons and explain different types of wisdom for the Buddhist audience. The Vedas are an example of Scripture for Hinduism. They contain hymns, mythology, poems, and prayers for Hindus to connect to something beyond themselves. And even thinking beyond religious traditions, we can understand the Declaration of Independence as a type of Scripture for the United States. The Declaration of Independence is something that is written down, that is authoritative. It was selected over a period of time. And it's something that connects us not necessarily to a higher power, but to a higher idea of what life should be like. This definition of Scripture is something we'll want to remember as we look at various texts in the Hebrew Bible, as well as other texts beyond religious traditions. Before we get into talking about the Hebrew Bible, we need to make a distinction between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. The two are often seen as synonymous, which is mostly the case. The Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament contain the same books, but in different orders. The distinction we want to make here is that the Old Testament, unlike the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, is seen from a Christian context. There cannot be an Old Testament without a New Testament. A Jew would not refer to the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament because that would imply that they believe in a New Testament, which talks about the coming of Jesus and Christianity. The Hebrew Bible, on the other hand, which is synonymous with Tanakh, we'll talk about that term a bit later, is seen in a Jewish context. Since we'll be talking about the Hebrew Bible and its importance for the Jewish culture, both in ancient times and today, we will want to use the term Hebrew Bible rather than Old Testament. We'll also be talking through the books of the Hebrew Bible in the order that the Jews set them up rather than how the Christian Old Testament changed it. Now that we've gotten through the introductory material and set up some definitions for our discussion of the Hebrew Bible, let's talk about what the Hebrew Bible is. The Hebrew Bible is simply an anthology. Many people understand it as a book, but a book usually has the same author, genre, topic, plot line, etc. So using the term book is a bit misleading. For example, reading The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien is a good example of a book. The storyline stays the same and develops with the same characters. All of the book is written by J.R.R. Tolkien, and the genre is fantasy. None of that changes throughout. On the other hand, the Hebrew Bible has a variety of books within it. Job is not written by an author that we know, but it talks about some kind of tale of trial and temptation of this character Job, and was seen by Jews as more of a moral lesson than something that historically happened. On the other hand, books like Samuel and Kings were written to record history. So the different genres show us that this can't just be one book, but rather is an anthology or a collection. A genre is essentially a literary category. It comes from the Latin, which means kind or sort. We've got a variety of different genres within the Hebrew Bible. As I said earlier, we have history in Samuel and Kings, but we can understand this more as interpreted history. The authors weren't concerned with recording historical records as much as telling historical facts and stories about things that mattered to them, not everything going on in the world like a history textbook might. The Hebrew Bible also contains legal codes and laws, prophetic texts, poetry, wisdom literature, and even apocalyptic literature that talks about the end times or mysterious things to come. What we have in the Hebrew Bible is a canon. A canon, from the Latin term, is a measuring rod or a ruler. A canon, when we talk about literary text, is something that has come about through the process of selection and is deemed authoritative. As we talked about earlier, this is what helps us understand what Scripture is. The Hebrew Bible, over time, was canonized, meaning different people selected what texts would go into this Bible. There were two major criteria for what would make up the Hebrew Bible. First was the date. Any texts that were in the Hebrew Bible were either written by someone or attributed to someone who lived before the 4th century BCE. Second, the original language of the text had to be in Hebrew. There are other texts that are not part of the Hebrew Bible, which we'll talk about a bit later, that were not canonized, but were still important for many Jews. This shows us this process of selection and how these two criteria were important for determining what the text and the canon of the Hebrew Bible would be. The Hebrew Bible is often called the Tanakh. Tanakh is an acronym standing for 3 different parts of the Hebrew Bible, which we'll talk about in this structure. The Tanakh consists of the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. The Torah, in Hebrew, means something like law or teachings. The Torah consists of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, beginning with Genesis, which recounts the creation and the early humans and early Israelites, and continues with the giving of the laws through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and tells the tale of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. Since the Torah is composed of laws and creation stories and other information, this is the part that most Jews find most important in the Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh as a whole. The second part of the Hebrew Bible is the Nevi'im. Nevi'im simply means prophets. The Nevi'im is composed of 2 major parts: the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets are composed of books that you might not consider prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. If you pick up a copy of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible today, you will probably find 2 separate works under Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, as you do under Kings. In the original manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, this was not the case. You'll find simply the book of Samuel and simply the book of Kings. For the latter prophets, there are again 2 major categories. The first are major prophets, and the second is minor prophets. The major prophets are composed of the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. The minor prophets in the Hebrew Bible are called the Book of the 12, and these consist of the final 12 books of the Hebrew Bible: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. The final part of the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, is called the Ketuvim. Ketuvim simply means writings. A decent way to understand what the Ketuvim is kind of a catch-all for everything that's not a prophetic work and is not part of the Torah or the law or teachings. This is not to say that the works here are not important, do not give laws, or do not contain some kind of important prophecies, but they're in a separate category. The books we find here are Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles. Again, in the original Hebrew manuscripts, we find Ezra and Nehemiah as one book rather than as 2 separate books, and the same with Chronicles. We'll conclude this video by talking about 3 different versions of the Hebrew Bible. Of course, the Hebrew Bible was originally written in Hebrew, but we do not get a complete text in Hebrew of the Hebrew Bible until the 10th century CE. This is called the Masoretic text, and you might see it abbreviated MT. Since this is such a late text, many scholars look back to an earlier text, which is called the Codex Sinaiticus. This is from the 4th century CE, about 600 years before the Hebrew text. However, this is in Greek. We call this the Septuagint. It's abbreviated as LXX, or Roman for 70, because there were originally 70 people working on translating the Hebrew text to Greek, according to the letter of Aristeas. The Septuagint contains not only the Hebrew Bible, but also contains the New Testament and some apocryphal books, or hidden books. These are books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, 1st Enoch, Baruch, and others. Another version worth mentioning is the Vulgate. The Vulgate, around the 4th century CE, was translated into Latin. The Hebrew text was translated, and this Latin text was very important to the Catholic Church, especially in the 16th century. These 3 major versions we'll talk about in the future, but be sure to understand the distinctions between them. The Masoretic text contains the Hebrew Bible in its entirety in Hebrew only. The Septuagint contains the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament as well as apocryphal books, but in Greek. And the Vulgate is in Latin and contains the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, as well as some apocryphal books. Now that we've arrived at the end of this video, for review, you should be able to define Scripture and apply the term. Explain what the Hebrew Bible is, including the difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. Identify and explain the 3 parts of the Tanakh, including their Hebrew name and what the Hebrew name means in English. And identify and explain the 3 major versions of the Hebrew Bible.